going to go ahead and get the show on the road. I think, Andy, you're in charge today, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So this is our 2020 State and Federal Legislative Priorities Workshop. And, Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, sir.
Jackson will not be here, I don't think, so I'm in charge for a little while.
Gotcha. Thank you and good afternoon, Commissioners. As always, it's a pleasure to be back here again to present our annual State and Federal Legislative Priorities Workshop. As you'll see around the table, as we do each year, we have invited our state and federal contract lobbying teams. We've got Jeff Sharkey and Taylor Beal here from our Capital Alliance Group team, as well as Vicki Cram and Sarah Vilms from Squire Patton Boggs. We've asked our federal lobbying teams again to join us here today to provide us just a quick synopsis of what we anticipate seeing in the upcoming 2020 Florida legislative session, as well as the next session of Congress. You'll hear from each of them in just a few moments. For today's workshop, just a quick overview, Commissioners. Nikki and I will be providing an overview of our proposed appropriations requests, followed by our recommended state and federal policy priorities for the coming year. And as I mentioned, our lobbying teams will give us an update on the upcoming state and federal legislative sessions. As we do each year, Commissioners, we'll plan to just kind of hit the highlights. All of the items that we'll be discussing today are there in full detail in your workshop materials. Of course, please stop us along the way if you have any questions. And of course, we'll plan to wrap up our portion of the presentation with plenty of time for the board to discuss, and we'll be happy to answer any other questions that you have at the end. Jumping right in, Commissioners, starting off with this year's proposed appropriations requests. As you see on the slide in front of you and in your workshop materials, we've got a list of 9 projects to seek legislative funding for. Many of these are going to be familiar to you from last year. As we've discussed in your workshop materials, Commissioners, we've identified these projects specifically for legislative funding because they do tend to align with the types of projects that the legislature has wanted to fund in recent years. First, going from the top of the list down, following the last 3 years consecutive of hurricanes impacting the state, the Florida legislature especially has started, and in particular this last 2019 legislative session, to fund some local projects that enhance communities' disaster resilience and planning at the local level. The first 2 projects on this slide are a backup generator and our mitigation and retrofitting projects for our branch libraries and community centers are in that category precisely. And again, so we're proposing that we seek funding for those projects. We've seen a number of those funded for communities throughout the state this last year. Next, Commissioners, as you know from our end of session report from the 2019 session that we presented to you just in July, we did get the next 2 of these projects, the Leon Works Expo and Orchard Pond Greenway Trail. Those were included in the budget that was adopted by the legislature. Unfortunately, didn't get across the finish line. We've had both of these projects in the legislature's budget for several years, but we know that as long as the legislature is interested in funding these projects, we'll continue to work with the governor's office and try to get them across the finish line. And finally, the final 5 projects on the list are all water projects, and we know for the last several years, as long as I can remember, and even farther back from there, the legislature has allocated a pot of money for local water projects. We anticipate that again to be the case this year. Those 5 projects, again, are in that same category, so staff recommends that we include those on our list of proposed projects for legislative funding. That wraps up our appropriations request, Commissioners. With that, what I'd like to do is take a moment and hand it over to Nikki Payton to walk us through our policy priorities for state and federal. Nikki?
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, Commissioners. As Andy mentioned, I'll be giving an overview of our proposed state policy priorities, which you'll see up on the screen and included in full detail in the workshop item before you. Commissioners, as you know, many of these priorities tend to be annual in nature, such as advocating on behalf of our state workforce and protecting local government's home rule authority. And others you'll already be familiar with, having seen these issues come up in the legislature in recent years. But I wanted to take the next few moments to give a few updates on several of these issues as they relate to the upcoming legislative session. First, Commissioners, protection of the state workforce is one of the county's top legislative priorities each year. Approximately 20,000 of our citizens are state employees, so our state workforce has a big effect on our community and our local economy. And with that in mind, advocating for the protection of our state workforce has consistently been a top priority of the board. Next, Commissioners, the high-impact tourist development tax has been a priority of the board in recent years as well. Commissioners, as a quick update, staff continues to coordinate with FSU to support the construction of a convention center as a component of FSU's Arena District. As you know, FSU has been working to finalize their market and feasibility study for the project. While the board will receive an update on those efforts through the IA board in the near future, staff recommends the board's continued support of this policy statement, which would allow the county, by a supermajority vote of the board, to levy this 6 cents of tourist development tax, which could be used to support the operating cost of a convention center once constructed. Next, we have Amtrak passenger rail restoration. Commissioners, as you know from our workshops and legislative reports in recent years, the Southern Rail Commission is a coalition of states along the Gulf Coast region that work together in advocating for the restoration of passenger rail service across this area. As I'll explain in greater detail during our federal overview, the Southern Rail Commission has recently been successful in getting grant dollars to fund some of the infrastructure repairs along the Gulf Coast route. As it relates to our state priorities, however, Florida is currently not a member of the Southern Rail Commission, and the Commission has expressed the importance of having the state of Florida's formal support for restoration of rail service as they continue their advocacy efforts going forward. Commissioners, next on the list is the protection of our canopy roads. As you know, canopy roads are one of the features that make our Leon County community unique. However, there have been a number of preemption-type bills in recent years that have threatened the county's long-standing canopy road protections. As we recently reported in our end-of-session report back in July, the legislature passed one of these bills last session, preempting local governments from requiring a permit for the removal of a tree that's been deemed a danger by a certified arborist, as well as preempting the enforcement of local tree replanting requirements for trees removed under these circumstances. Going into the 2020 session, staff will continue to watch for any similar bills this year. Commissioners, as you may recall, as recently as 2017, there were efforts in the legislature to consider options for the relocation of the state capitol. And in fact, there has already been a similar bill filed again this year. And similar to the importance of protecting our state workforce, as I mentioned previously, staff recommends the board to oppose efforts to consider the relocation of the capitol outside of Leon County. And next, we have public safety on college and university campuses. In other words, Commissioners, this is the guns on campus issue that you've seen in recent years. As you may recall, the presidents of FSU, FAMU, and TCC have opposed bills that have been filed in the last few years that would allow concealed weapons on college and university campuses. And back in 2015, the board adopted a resolution to the same effect. Bills related to guns on campus have also already been filed for this upcoming session, and staff is recommending the board's continued opposition of such proposals. Finally, Commissioners, as you know, the Florida Association of Counties works on behalf of all 67 counties in Florida in addressing issues of statewide impact, such as opposition to unfunded mandates and preserving home rule authority. Each year, as part of their advocacy efforts, FACT develops its legislative program for the upcoming session during its Innovation and Policy Conference, which will actually be taking place a little later this week in Bay County. And they will finalize their legislative platform during their legislative conference in November. As you'll see up on the screen and in your workshop material, staff is again recommending the board's support of FACT's legislative program for the upcoming 2020 legislative session. And with that, Commissioners, I'd like to hand it over to Jeff Sharkey with the Capital Alliance Group to give us a quick overview of what to expect during the upcoming legislative session.
Thank you, Nikki. Commissioners, thanks for the opportunity to be here again. Again, it's an honor and a privilege to represent Leon County. I would say we're excited about this year's legislative session. Maybe temper that a little bit, but as you know, the sessions alternates every two months difference every other year. So this year, the legislative session is starting 2 months earlier. We've had 1 week of interim committee meetings last week, and then we'll have 2 weeks in October, 3 weeks in November, 1 week in December, and then we start the regular, what they call the regular session, January through February, ends the first part of March. So it's been an interesting year, obviously, notwithstanding hurricanes and recovery in Bay County, but it's really watching Governor DeSantis move forward and get his footing, as it were. He is, I have to say, we're all quite impressed with his activity and his energy level and his willingness to really go out and meet with people throughout the state. So we've been involved in several of those activities and found him and his staff, his top staff in the Executive Office of the Governor to be very accessible, very willing to talk about issues. that kind of leads me into our appropriations issues from last year. I think both Andy and Nikki did a great job. We're obviously very committed to working very quickly to get these appropriations items moving, getting our legislative delegation, which, as you know, includes our new member, Jason Schoaf, Representative Schoaf, who took Halsey Bashir's spot. We've met with him several times. He's very focused, obviously, on rebuilding over in his part of the world, but understands that Leon County is important to his district, and so we've already met with him on a couple of issues. We do have, there are 338 bills that have been filed already. That process will continue, where we, of course, capture and monitor the bills that we think are important, obviously, for the county. Interesting, talking about firearms, there are 5 firearm bills that have already been filed. That seems to, even in light of the ballot amendment that's going on assault weapons, there continues to be strong support for filing bills for carrying concealed weapons, as well as limiting concealed weapons. So that battle will rage again this year. The governor's been very interesting in his kind of seemingly apolitical support for environmental issues, for water quality issues, for hurricane preparedness issues, for economic development issues, and for children's issues. His wife, as the First Lady, has been very active in supporting mental health and children's issues. So that's been actually very positive. We've been involved in a number of those initiatives and activities. So we have a very close relationship with the governor's chief of staff and his key people. And so that leading again into some of the vetoes we got last year after working very hard on getting the legislature to approve them in a very tight budget year last year. We feel very confident. We've met with OPB on if I have to drag this Leon County Works program, the finish line again, it's as little money as it is, it's a very top priority, and it's certainly consistent with the governor and Richard Corcoran, the Commissioner of Education's interest in apprenticeship programs. I mean, they're really focusing on that in terms of career and workforce training, so we feel very confident about that again this year.
Well, speaking of job creation, I saw the governor is asking for quite a lot more money than last year for the job creation, which might give us a heads up on Leon Works and apprenticeship programs.
Correct.
You're feeling more positive?
Yeah.
No, we did.
I mean, he had a press conference last week, 2 weeks ago, on additional funding for career and workforce training, $10 million for apprenticeship programs, right? That in addition to what's in existence. So, we've talked to the Commissioner of Education about it, and the legislators are very supportive. So it's in sync. It always has been to some extent, but I think his staff, who we met with after the session when these issues, the Leon County issues, were in the budget, had passed in the budget, and went to the staff and briefed them on this. We must have talked about Leon Works 5 times with his OPB staff. At that point in time, the governor was relatively new, really made decisions somewhat independently, listened, went through the list, and made his veto recommendations. We feel much more confident that his learning curve and his staff's ability to understand where he's coming from, we will, I think we'll be much more positive.
And wasn't he concerned with if things hadn't gone through agency review, that was
right.
He was just axing out.
That's what's explained.
I don't know if that was
that's
what they said.
Yeah.
Could I?
So
Could I ask one more?
I'm sorry.
Just to explain to me a little bit the local option high impact tourist development tax. What does that do? That just gives local governments authority to then pass something like that by supermajority, it looked like? Or what does it do?
You want me to handle this?
Don't really.
If you'd like, I'm happy to handle it as well.
Exactly
Andy and I spent a lot of time on this one.
sure have.
Why don't you
Absolutely.
explain what it does and why we've been working on it for 2 or 3 years, and some of the little hurdles we've experienced.
Sure. In a nutshell, the long and the short of it, there are a number of different tourist development taxes. There's 1 cent and another cent. There's a combination of different ones, and they all have different eligibility. Specifically, the high impact tourist development tax is a 1 cent tax, and there are, I want to say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 counties in the state that are eligible. And the criteria are pretty specific. One, you have to be either a very large county that has a high volume of hotel bed night stays or transactions that are subject to the TDT. or otherwise you're a smaller county that has a huge proportion of their total taxable sales that are made up of TDT.
And it's on the bed tax?
It's on the bed tax, yes. And so for us, Leon County's maxed out at 5 cents of TDT, and this would be if we could get authorization from the legislature, would provide a 6 cent of tourist development tax that, again, the board would have the option by supermajority to adopt.
Thanks. That was what I didn't realize or didn't remember, the 5 cent cap that we already have. Thanks.
Correct. And it would impact 2 counties potentially, Alachua and Leon, and it would provide funding for the operations of the arena district. Anytime you talk about a new tax or an increase in taxes, you get a little heartburn in the House over across the street. So we're working on that this year, and with Senator Monford's final year, some going away stuff, and I think this is going to be one of the things we've been talking to him about. The budget estimates are for this year, estimating $298 million in surplus this year, but then subsequent 2 years, about $800 million short. Some of that has to do with the gaming compact and the revenues from the Seminole Tribe, et cetera. But so there's a slight slowdown in the state's economy, so that'll certainly affect revenues. But we're obviously very focused on protecting the state workforce. There's I don't know if it's a gaggle or a flock or a pod of preemption bills every year that we work very closely with the Florida Association of Counties and FAIR, which is the county-city legislative intergovernmental relations group on those. And, I think we've had some positive impact on holding off some of those. It seems to never, you're never shy about that in the House over there. So with that, but let me, before I stop talking, I think I forgot to mention Glenna Juarez is with our team. I appreciate her coming by. She's here and in Orlando and all over the state, but she's been very effective with us. Of course, Taylor Beal is a madman during the legislative session on appropriations, and it makes a lot of enemies, but they're all friends, So, but he's very effective at helping on these appropriations. And Lauren Galla, who's our new hire in the office, and so has worked for Representative Chris Latvala in the past, and we're excited about having her with us. So again, thank you. Any questions you might have after our good friends from Patton Boggs speak, I'd be happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've added a little bit to my priority of housing a little bit, and Commissioner Deloge, you've brought this up in the past, but it's something that I'm really concerned about, and that's our jail population. I've had a conversation with our sheriff, and he talked about just how much we're moving towards our capacity and the possibilities of us having to make some moves in the way of either providing more beds or looking at a new facility. But the reality of it is that there's a lot of people in our jails who necessarily does not belong in our jails, and I'm speaking specifically about the mental health side of it. Is there any movement at the state level to move to address, and again, Commissioner Deloge brought this up a while back, but move to address the population or the increased population of mental health cases that reside within our jails and prisons across the state, and how we can look at more innovative ways to move them to the proper facilities they need to be in versus being in our jails and our prisons.
So for the last 2 years, the chair of the Criminal Justice Appropriations Committee, Senator Brandes, has been working on criminal justice reform issues, reducing felony amounts, and trying to reduce the number of folks who are first entering, county jails and then going to the DOC. So there's that piece which he's gotten little slivers of. The House has been a little reluctant. This year, however, just last week, the new Secretary of the Department of Corrections did a presentation on his budget request, and mental health issues, training inside the fence were big. Now, that doesn't address your question, but that in terms of release and repatriation of the community, try to help people who have mental health issues and substance abuse issues inside the fence once they're there. But it's becoming much more well recognized in terms of how do we intercede prior to, whether it's a diversion program, or a Appalachian Mental Health Center, can identify individuals beforehand with law enforcement. I think that's the connection that people are talking about, is how do we address some of these folks before they they're repeat offenders for the most part. So,
or even at the point, I was talking to my chief of staff about it, but even at the point of intake, how do we figure out who actually belongs within those fences and who actually belongs in a facility, whether it's a mental health facility or something similar to a assisted care facility for those who need it. So they're not sitting in our jails for something that really should be a medicated type of situation.
Yeah.
So I don't know necessarily if that's more of a local issue when it comes to the process of intake.
Correct.
Or if statewide they would have more control over that. But it's becoming an issue that's a little bit out of control. We have people in our community that belong in jail.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people in our jail, and I would imagine, say, a vast majority of people in our jail that simply are there because they're homeless or they have a mental case issue and they get their medication while they're there. So I don't want to have to move in the direction of addressing a jail population issue because of the people who don't necessarily belong there. If we had criminals in there that were that belonged in jail because of what they have done or because they were that bad, but if it's a medical issue like mental health, if there's something we can do at the state level to avoid, to make it more efficient for us to deal with it, rather than having to house them in the jail, I really like to move in that direction. I don't know. I mean, that may be something that become more of a fact issue, but I know it's one that we're going to have to address here in Leon County.
Correct.
And that's going to be a big check to write if we have to move in the direction of building a new facility or even building more beds onto our own facility. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I had there. I was just curious about what they may be doing at the state level and how we can move in the direction of making it a legislative priority for us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Minor, you want to weigh in?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quick, I have a question for Commissioner Maddox. I couldn't actually ask this outside of the public meeting, but I know last year, in our materials, it said last year that Florida Association of Counties had unanimously supported the local option higher back tourist development tax. Do you expect FACT to be doing that again? I know we've got our conference coming up.
Yes, I do expect for that, for FACT to be supporting it as well as it being a major priority.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Dozier.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you all very much. Just a couple of questions, and I guess I'll start with your comments about Leon Works, Jeff. You and I talked about this soon after session a couple times. So I'm hearing a slight difference, and I get this is, I would guess, applicable to other issues as well, kind of what you've learned about the governor's office, his learning curve, which is completely understandable, that you think the Leon Works program is a good request to make, fits within the focus on apprenticeships. So that's your first thought.
yes.
It still is not a program that provides apprenticeship training program. So we still need more funding for that. Is there any local requests that you're aware of for additional programming dollars for apprenticeships? Is there any way that we could support those efforts or acquire funds to help connect businesses so they can hire apprenticeships? And some of this is in statute, is in the policy end of how we make it easier for apprenticeships or apprentices to be hired by business. So do you see anything else working in that space that we could focus on?
Yeah, and I'll get you the language. So, there's an existing set of apprenticeship programs that flow either through high schools and state colleges, community colleges. It's a formula driven. It's been there for years. It sometimes expands the number, the type of career apprenticeship areas. So for nurses and CNAs and et cetera. Just 2 weeks ago, the governor announced with the Commissioner of Education, this new apprenticeship effort, which is really kind of almost driven more by CareerSource Florida as much as anything else. Like I said, it's $10 million. I don't know, that doesn't go a long way necessarily, but I have not seen anything coming from the city or from PCC or Lively School District at this point, but as the session begins, we will certainly see how these budgets start to lay out, and if there's something that fits, something that we could do and support, whether it's through the school district. Everybody's got their little silos,
Right.
So, but if there is a particular area, that's why Leon Works, I think, is really interesting, because it really takes these students in high school and really exposes them and trains them and gives them an idea of what these job opportunities might be with real people who are doing it. So we'll track that. I think it's going to be a big year for apprenticeship opportunities.
I completely agree that Leon Works is unique, and personally, I think other communities would benefit from modeling that program. My concern is that we are creating a demand for programs that may not fully exist because of funding, and even if they do exist, there is a struggle having businesses draw from those programs and bring people into their business. Some programs work better than others, the HVAC, welding, things like that. My understanding has been also that some of the funding is tied to posting jobs at CareerSource. So to support our efforts in Leon Works and our partners in the community, I would be very interested to hear if there is, and this may fall back, I'm looking at you, Andy, to you and Nikki, through Jeff and others, that if there is any policy areas or anything that we could work on or suggest or support when it comes to making sure that our the pipeline exists and it is clearly defined for businesses so that we can put people to work, that would really complement our efforts. Is that a fair way to approach it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And could I just add to what you're saying, too, because I think that's been one of the if there are complaints about Leon Works, and haven't been many, it's that it hasn't really transferred over to businesses to buy in and say, yeah, we want to set up apprenticeships, too. I think we do have, I think OEV was pretty thorough, or maybe it wasn't OEV, but it was Christina, in finding out what jobs are already available and going wanting for people, but that is a big hurdle for us to get out of the schools and get young people interested and aware, but also getting the businesses, so they have to come together. So any effort in that way, just to your point, is really essential.
I'm looking over your shoulder here. Christina's in the room. So yes, OEV, Christina, thank you, has been working closely with all of our partners. In construction industry specifically, there's still a bottleneck. So framing and other types of construction, our contractors can't find employees, but the programs aren't full. So we still need to address some of that locally, but also I am hearing that state and federal, there may be some ways that we used to do apprenticeships that would help businesses get into this, or get back into the apprenticeship model that we've kind of lost over the last 30 years. So just any additional information, or as we see that coming, that would be great. I think it would be helpful if, Christina, we can just talk about this, as we talk across the street with the appropriations people and members and our delegation. If we have businesses that are saying, because we represent the National Electrical Contractors Association, big organization, they fund 75. They do apprenticeship programs all the time. And they fund about 65 to 75% of it, and then they get funding. But if there are construction companies in town, I know you probably know one or two construction. Yeah. We could potentially, get their voice into this. I mean, what do they really need? What kind of training do they need? I mean, and then back that into some of these potential. There's going to be money there, some money there. Yes.
And you tell, where are the high priorities with reconstruction and rebuilding over in the Panhandle. I mean, I know for a fact it's very difficult. I mean, Representative Schoaf has told us this, Representative Trumbull has told us this. It's just you can't find anybody, and they can't house them first of all. But then they can't find anybody to do the framing.
Workforce housing.
And also, you can't overstate this connection to the poverty in our region because of lack of jobs.
Right.
So, I mean, I think everything, the hip bone's connected to the thigh bone, and this is a really different, important aspect to bring forward to legislators and the feds. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. It is, and there, I would like our focus, we did this during the recession, and I think the initial legislative meetings that we hosted that time, Commissioner Deloge, you were leading that effort to kind of look for shovel-ready projects across the region, not just Leon, Tallahassee, at least in our partnering counties. So on the workforce piece, TCC is working with Chipola, the Planning Council, and EDA grants. They're all working with Chipola to try to stand up apprenticeship programs as well. That benefits our folks, it benefits theirs and the region. So I think that this is that's why I'm spending a little time on it, so is Commissioner Lindley and others. It also relates to the Job Grant Growth Fund, and I know there's an additional request from the governor that will be in his budget. I am going to hope that we see more of a structure with that program. I'm not sure we will, but I'm wondering if you're seeing anything in DEO's budget, if we've seen that yet, or anything else for how to administer a revolving loan fund, for how to administer the Jobs Growth Grant Fund, any of those types of things. You may not have that information now, but I think those procedures would be very helpful to know if they're going to be working on them or updating them in the future. Okay, so Mr. Chair now, welcome. I have two quick other questions. One, you mentioned before, Jeff, that you've been very impressed by how the governor is working, and I agree. There's a large number of partisan issues and discussions that are happening now that we haven't seen happen in a long time, and that's really exciting. And I will say, beyond bipartisan, local and state connection that we haven't seen in a while. Department of Emergency Management I think, is doing some incredible work that has not been championed as much around the state. They have pushed out money that has been backlogged since 14 and before for other hurricanes and storms. Any way that we can support additional funding for DEM would be a very a big interest to me, and I think that would be a way to signal our support for something the state is doing that helps all regions. So I would love to know more about that and see if we could support those efforts. I believe there will be a departmental appropriation request that looks different this year than any past year. It'll include a statewide evacuation study that is well overdue and needed and would be conducted from the 10 planning councils around the state. So really want to support that effort, and we need it here for the evacuation study and others. Is that?
Yeah, no, we had lunch with the Secretary or Director Moskowitz last week, and you know what a dynamo he is, and yeah, he laid out kind of how this storm preparedness had happened, what they plan to do in the future, really getting out in front of pre-positioning assets all over the state, and what he's going to be requesting. So he's, you know, I think under his and the governor's leadership, the state will be better prepared for sure.
I think we already are.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and it's only
And the state received glowing, recognition for the executive offices and Director Moskowitz's handling of hurricane preparedness already.
He jumped into the middle of a mess after 4 months after Hurricane Michael, and it's been incredible work. So good. The last comment I would make, Mr. Chair, and this can just be left as a comment: any additional funding for bike and trails. I mean, I know we've got it in our request for our project list, but there are statewide networks. There's Suncoast Trails, others. I wonder if there's other monies available, and I've been told recently there's a community designation for trails and bikes that a lot of communities have not sought. So if there's any programs like that that could increase our funding for bikes and trails, either directly to the county, city, or CRTPA, I'd love to keep an eye out about that.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Jeff.
Want to say anything? You're good.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Great follow-up work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank all of you for all your hard work. Andy and Nikki, I used to have your job at the city years ago, working as a liaison between the city and our federal and state lobbyists. I know how much work it is. So thanks to you too, and to all of you at the table. Yesterday, I spoke with Altemise Barnes of the Riley Center Museum, and for the first time since 2009, she's not currently in track to receive money for the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, or FAA-HPN. She had been working with Florida Secretary of State Lori Lee, who had agreed to place that museum network funding in her agency request. She put it in there, but it had been rejected by the governor's office for some reason. Nevertheless, Secretary Lee has, according to Ms. Barnes, has committed to helping her as much as she can. What I'd like to do is have a motion to add an additional appropriations request for the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network in the amount of what they received last year, which is $450,000. Now, that's for a statewide network, which is a good thing because Governor Scott and now Governor DeSantis have a history of vetoing projects that are not of a statewide focus. But the Riley House would receive about 25% of that $450,000, which is about $112,000. And Riley would remain the headquarters of that African American Heritage Museum Network, which would bring more people into Tallahassee and continue to help with our tourism. A year or two ago, FSU's Department of Economic Forecasting did a study on the economic benefit of the entire statewide museum network and came up with an economic benefit of $51 million statewide, as well as 433 jobs. So that's statewide. Those are statewide numbers, 51 million and then 433 jobs. But Tallahassee, as the headquarters with Riley Museum, they surely get a large portion of that. So with that, I'd like to introduce a motion in the amount of $450,000 for an appropriation request. Here's the thing, and Jeff and Taylor, please correct me if I'm off base a bit here. Because this is of a different nature than our infrastructure projects, this request and the work that Jeff and Taylor would be doing would not impact the other infrastructure project requests that we have. They're going to go to a different appropriations subcommittee chairman. So therefore, there's not much of a danger of cannibalizing our other requests by adding this appropriation request to our priorities. Is that correct, Jeff?
Correct.
Okay. So with that, I have that motion.
Commissioner Dozier on point.
Just had a quick question on point. I'm glad to have an update about this, and I'm sorry that the funding may be in danger this year. I just wanted to kind of check, and Andy or Mr. County Administrator, you might be able to address this, how we have dealt with other types of requests from our partners in the past, whether they be a higher ed institution, FSU, or a nonprofit like Riley House. My perspective is, or my memory is that we have lent our support to a request that they might be making, but it's not necessarily a Leon County request. Is that a difference that matters much or not? I'm just curious.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Dozier, I think your memory is right on. We do have language that we have adopted each year at this time with this packet. It's kind of broad language that says that you give us the authority to support community projects that may align with the board's priorities, again, among various community partners out there. So it's sort of broad language, but you've also adopted specifics in the past that you felt like maybe rise to the level of incorporating specifically as part of your legislative platform.
Okay. I'm supportive of supporting Riley House. I just want to make sure that we're posturing it in the right way. So I guess I would like to hear from others about this. It seems to be a different type of request than infrastructure projects or apprentice programs, things that we might be operating ourselves or working, county in partnership with others. So if there's a way to really lift up certain partners instead of just having a general, we support other partner legislative priorities, if there's a way to highlight a few of those
Commissioner Maddox
might be helpful.
Commissioner Maddox on point. Okay. Motion's been made. It's been seconded by Commissioner Maddox. I see another. Yes, on point. Mr. Loesch.
Yeah, Commissioner Dozier, to your earlier comment, I mean, we did that with infrastructure when they had the big, we all agreed that, sewer, in Wakulla was going to be good for us in Leon County. More bridges in Gadsden County. So even though this is not a Leon County specific project, I think it's appropriate if we can offer her a little bit of a lift. Why not at least that, help. So.
But could I just, so it would be a statewide funding request is what you're proposing?
Mr. Chairman?
Correct?
Yeah, yes, it would. So should you approve the motion, what we would, according to the way I stated the motion, it would be an appropriation request of $450,000 for the statewide Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, which is a network of 32.
I'm familiar with it. I know it's.
Okay, I'm sorry. But about 25% of that $450,000 would come into Leon County through the Riley House.
Yeah, we have a special interest in. Okay, I'm supportive.
Did you have something to add?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, real quick, I just wanted to explain my second. I understand the questions that Commissioner Dozier had, but I believe that support of this shows our support of African American history within the state of Florida. And all that may not specifically go to Leon County, but I believe it's important enough for us to put as a priority for us, knowing that a piece of that will go towards Riley House. So I'm extremely supportive of this priority. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, with that said, motion's been made and it's been seconded. We'll go ahead and vote at this time. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed by the same sign. Motion passes. Commissioner Proctor, you're in queue.
Thank you, Chairman. To our third lobbyist, I asked the question, what is there afoot to assist and aid our historically black colleges and universities? I know that there's been a hostile environment under the current Secretary of Education, and I know that the President of the United States has signaled an interest in moving the needle. We have an HBCU here in this community, in my district. It ranks the 7th among public HBCUs. Is there any thawing out of the ice cold frigid temperatures that has existed in Washington under this president?
No, it should be on.
Sorry. Hi, Commissioner Proctor. There has been, not to sugarcoat it, there has been a falling out in Washington kind of all over the place, as you guys have all watched the news. But I think as far as the historically black colleges and universities, and, Vicki and I can tag team in answering this question, there has been a long-standing grant program for those universities, and I think that's well protected by Congress. It's a bipartisan consideration. So even though the administration may be hostile in certain circumstances, there is an effort to make sure that that program is significant, is fully funded, and is executed appropriately. I'll give you an example of a project that I was working on that, not necessarily for a historically black college or university, but the University of Georgia. They had some of their grants held up by this president, and we worked with the Congress to make sure that those grants were released on time and in time for their research to go forward. So there is significant pushback that Congress can be. Vicki, did you want to add anything to that?
No, but we'd be happy to get you more information on that and prepare a briefing for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that funding for these entities often is outside the loop, sort of like the motion that Commissioner Minor just made for African American history stuff. You have to go outside the normal process, or the standard bearers and the doorkeepers don't see it as something that ought to be funded. So just like this motion previously made and this board supported, HBCUs, Black Heritage, trails, whatever, they all float outside of the normative process, so to speak. Let me indicate that 32304 is a zip code here in Leon County. It has been identified as our most impoverished zip code in the state of Florida. And to both teams, federal and state, what landmark opportunities are out there to address poverty, in particular when it has been well documented, chronicled, researched, and is widely known that there are issues regarding education, regarding health, economic development. We have the poorest, according to measures and matrices that weigh these things, we have the poorest zip code in Tallahassee. Are there federal support or state support that can change and transform that reality?
Well, it is it's like the elephant in the room a lot of the times over in the Capitol, statewide. Interesting enough, the Florida Chamber of Commerce did a report on which was quite remarkable and somewhat unexpected, which is certainly started the narrative at that level. But there's different, as you know, Commissioner, there are different pieces of this. There are how the community comes together around this is certainly one piece. Where state funding comes in, you have certainly funding for Title I schools, at-risk kids schools, free and reduced lunch. I mean, all the food bank support. That's one slice of it. Jobs development, workforce development, the apprenticeship program we're training. Does it come together? Does the state look at this in a holistic fashion? I would say no. It comes in different silos. The effort, for the school, the community-based school that perhaps looks at mental health, looks at healthcare, looks at employment opportunities. I mean, that's really the way it it probably has to be most effective. But the state doesn't really fund kind of integrated programs like that from different budget silos. But there's certainly money for mental health for families and foster parents and children and then there's educational programs, and sometimes they start to work together at the regional or local level, and they try to communicate that to legislators. And we're working on an early child court bill that helps mothers and parents who have substance abuse and mental health problems. So you're taking kids away from families. I mean, there's all these different pieces to it. I don't mean to ramble on this, but there's no comprehensive approach to this. Okay. I think it really has to come from the community, up to some extent.
Okay. Federal, you all have anything that's looking at, I know Baltimore was lifted up recently, Congressman Cummings, and said that he had a poor, raggedy, roach and rat infested district. And I think a look was taken to see exactly what efforts by federal government were lent to Baltimore to offset what the president himself described as a pretty poor area. Are there any particular programs or policy instruments that can help lift and transform areas documented to be Florida's most impoverished?
Absolutely, and we can also get you a briefing on that. There's EDA funding and RUS funding, Rural Utilities Service funding, there's SNAP funding. We can put together a bunch of programs that your county could your district could help get access through, if they're not already.
I also think that the most recent program that's been sort of targeted towards low-income areas and poverty areas is the Opportunity Zone program, which was created by the tax cut bill in the last Congress, and they have come out with now all the regulations. They're starting to come online with investments. The White House has put together a council on opportunity zones. They are trying to focus as many of their other grant programs on opportunity zones, so that if you're applying for a grant and it's in an opportunity zone, you will get preference. They have asked for the EDA, the Economic Development Administration within the Department of Commerce, has asked for comments from local governments and other partners on how they see Opportunity Zones working, and we have supplied comments to EDA. We did that last week, I think, Christina? Yeah. There is a concern about gentrification and a concern about reporting what sort of investments are in those zones because there's no actual reporting requirement. The authors of the zone, who are Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, have introduced new legislation to create some reporting requirements so that you actually know whether the opportunity zones are working or not. Those have been introduced, they haven't been passed, and they would probably be attached to some sort of tax vehicle if one moves forward before the end of the year. So I think that's the most recent effort to try to target resources to a very impoverished community.
Very good. My next question flips and goes the opposite direction. We enjoy and have experienced tremendous quantitative growth at Florida State University, which is also in my district, and it has leaped to being classified as our nation's 18th ranked public institution.
That's great.
Which is like a woohoo. What educational incentives are there of which entity like Florida State would qualify for incentives there for its full range and the plethora of research infrastructure that it has in place and monies that they could accede to as a basis of how they qualify as a U.S. ranked public institution now. And I would be curious to know that you're able to possibly research and see what special goodies come with being in the elite upper tier for our other state university in my district. And then, Mr. Chairman, those are the things that my inquiry was about, and my closing observations or comments that are not questions pertains to the support for the waiver of student loan indebtedness, which has come to my awareness exceeds $1 trillion. And when the young people of America are wading through that kind of inertia, if you will, it is very important that if there's a legislative movement, and Senator Warren has talked about it, Senator, the man running for president, the next guy has talked about it, what's his name?
Ernie.
Yeah. Senator Sanders has talked about it. And this whole notion of, and we have students who come through Tallahassee, nearly 70,000 students, many who have to put that albatross of debt. And it's hard to be free, it's hard to be outspoken. We would never see the 60s generation again because there's a muzzle upon college students, young people with ideas. They can't talk. They just have to go to work and try to get free. And any efforts to support the waiver of American student debt, I think would be a worthy cause. And I would just, as one commissioner, would be interested in knowing that. And I think that we as a body, given the clientele that come year after year, would support it. And then finally, the observation of the forgiveness of loans for medical providers. And I'm not recently updated about that, but at one point, if a physician worked in rural areas, areas that were underserved, served poor people, so many Medicaid patients, that there was a forgiveness of their debt. And I would definitely be curious to know how that could be effectuated to benefit area doctors, in particular those who are coming out of the Florida State Medical School here in Tallahassee. That would be very meaningful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I would be, thank you, Commissioner Proctor. I'd be remiss if I did not stand on a soapbox at this point to say that teachers that teach in Title I schools have a loan forgiveness option after teaching for 3 consecutive years in Title I school, 100% loan forgiveness. So if there's, I don't see a whole lot of potential teachers in the room, but I'll be happy to sign you up if you want to get with me afterwards. But that's one particular program. And then I'm also reminded of the community school that we just opened over at Sable Palm that's actually in the center of the 32304 zip code that kind of combines partnerships at the state, local, and university levels, both FAMU and Florida State, as well as our local school system, and Title I funding that occurs there to have a clinic located directly across from a public school that is dealing with some of the ills that you talked about involving poverty in 32304. But thank you. Good points. Any other commissioners? Commissioner Lindley.
Well, I was just as a process, since we only have 30 minutes to discuss the federal priorities, would it be appropriate for me to make a motion to pass our state priorities with the addition of Commissioner Miners so we could move forward, because we have a meeting starting in 30 minutes?
Absolutely. We have
I know, but the state priorities as a whole, including with inclusion on that. I mean, is that appropriate, or if you want to wait,
I
it's
think,
up to you, but we only have...
Right now, we are looking at staff recommendations for option 1. It's just, this is not a separate...
No, my
motion.
point is, we only have 30 minutes to discuss the federal priorities, and I didn't know if it would be appropriate to go ahead and say however we feel about the state priorities, just in an interest of time.
Okay.
So that was my motion, to say yes to state priorities, only at this point. I know we have 3 parts of that.
Yeah. Motion's been made and it's been seconded. Commissioner Proctor on point.
Mr. Chairman, I concur. I will be supporting the motion. I want to confirm it, but I believe that we have scheduled a legislative meeting for the public in January that will start something like 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. in the morning. And I saw that some weeks ago and forgot to see if we could flip that around to make it accessible to the public. And I will confirm what's been published as a time for for the community's ability to come and talk to the legislature. And I think
Commissioner Minor is wanting to jump in.
Is it? Is it in the a.m.? I think so. Okay. I think we should change it
how about
to
we make a
PM.
note to have the administrator to check that date and time.
Mr. Chairman,
Andy.
just for clarification, Commissioners,
Andy.
you've got your Community Legislative Dialogue meeting, which is the meeting that we host annually. We invite community stakeholders in to discuss not only our legislative priorities adopted by the board, but our community priorities, our partners' priorities as well. Find opportunities to share our efforts there. That's scheduled for February the 14th. The board had scheduled that in July when we brought our end of session report. I will also mention that our annual legislative delegation meeting, which, as you know, is a meeting of the delegation chaired by Senator Montford in these chambers, is scheduled for late October, and we can get you that date. I believe it's the 28th. And that's in the evening. That starts at 5:30, and that's an opportunity for all members of the public who are, of course, also welcome at our dialogue meeting. But that's an opportunity for them to come and address the delegation members personally as well. So those are 2 different meetings that provide some opportunities in that regard.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I see it now. The February 14th meeting is a 9 to 10:30 a.m. community legislative dialogue meeting. And if it really is the community's dialogue, I'm hopeful we can make that more flexible than 9 a.m. I mean, not saying that we'll pick up any one additionally. It's a theoretic that typically more people come to a 6 to 7:30 dialogue versus a 9 to 10:30 a.m. And I think that as government, we should make it as accessible as possibly we can. Now, that's February the 14th, ain't it? That's what it says.
Valentine's Day.
And I know that that's Valentine's Day. And legislation and Valentine's Day just don't go together. Jeff, I'm sorry about that,
That's
Jeff.
not the kind of Valentine you want.
No.
Commissioner Lindley, you want to readdress the motion that you had, and I think it's noted, Commissioner Proctor, that we'll look at the timing for the February 14th, Valentine's Day meeting. Maybe someone's heart will be in the right place. Commissioner Lindley.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I just really wanted to get to the federal side as well.
Okay.
We've got a very short amount of time, so if we can take the vote and move on. Thank you.
Yes, motion's been made and it's been seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign. Motion passes. I'll let Commissioner Lindley go ahead and jump in here.
I was just interested in hearing what the federal presentation was before we vote, because we have two other pieces of this. Thank you.
All right, with that, Commissioners, we have 3 federal priorities before you today. The first of these is support of Amtrak passenger rail restoration. As I mentioned earlier, the Southern Rail Commission recently was awarded $33 million in federal grant funds to support major rail improvements in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And at the federal level, the most pressing need at this time is for Congress to continue funding these grant programs that would help restore rail infrastructure along this route, which is reflected in the policy priority before you today. And then next, Commissioners, is the foreign trade zone issue, another one that you'll recall from recent years. Just a quick update, OEV has been in close coordination with Tallahassee International Airport staff in supporting the development of a foreign trade zone, which would enhance the global competitiveness of local businesses in our community interested in engaging in foreign commerce. Staff is recommending the board's continued support of those efforts. And then finally, Commissioners, similar to FAC at the state level, the National Association of Counties advocates on behalf of all county governments addressing federal issues before Congress, and staff is recommending the board's support of NACO's legislative program as well. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sarah Vilms and Vicki Cram with Squire Patton Boggs to give us a quick overview of what to expect during the second session of the 116th Congress.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Commissioners, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. We've had the chance to visit with many of you, and thank you very much for your time. It's always helpful for us to hear what you're concerned about, because we can have our ears and eyes open on the ground for you in Washington, D.C. I'm here with Vicki Cram, who is my colleague, and she is the co-chair of the Local Governments Practice Group. We're just going to cover 4 items for you today, and we'll tag team them, but I'll give you a quick overview. We'll cover the continuing resolution to keep the government funding, some appropriations outlook, the waters of the U.S., recent actions, and the infrastructure packages being proposed in Congress that may be moving. So let me start with the big news. You probably saw last week the House passed the continuing resolution, which would fund, I should back up, the House and Senate have not passed their FY20 appropriations bills yet again this year in similar fashion to last year. So they will not have time to get it done before the fund expires by September 30th to fund the entire federal government. So in order to avoid a government shutdown, the House last week introduced and passed a continuing resolution which would continue to fund the government through November 21st. Along with that package includes an extension of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is important to Leon County. Obviously, it protects homes from catastrophic flooding and losses and damages. It also carries with it an extension for the Export-Import Bank, which is important for small businesses in Leon County. Again, those pieces are only also funded until November 21st. And it also includes various health programs, Medicaid, Medicare programs, funding for community health centers, mental health and substance abuse treatment, TANF, that's the temporary assistance for needy families, child care entitlement, and one last piece that's kind of interesting, the House package includes a demand from the Department of Agriculture to report to Congress about the effects of the trade war on farmers. So that's the House package. We expect the Senate to pick up that bill this week. There's discussion that the Senate will also pass the same House bill. They could also make changes to it, but they're supposed to address that bill this week. I'm going to turn over to Vicki to talk about appropriations.
So this year, there was no budget agreement at the beginning of the year to sort of guide the appropriations process at the beginning of the FY 2020 appropriations process. So the House, because they had a new House majority of Democrats who wanted to show that they could move things on time, began to mark up the bills with their own top line budget number. They passed all 10 of they marked up all 12 of the appropriations bills. They passed 10 of them out of the House. Right before the August recess at the very end of July, the House and Senate came together with a budget agreement, an overarching budget agreement. It's a 2-year budget deal, so that means we don't have to go through this process again next year of creating a budget agreement. And it also suspended the debt limit until July 2021, so that's after the election. It raised discretionary spending caps by $321 billion over 2 years. It provided an extra $2.5 billion for the census. It prevented sequestration, which would have occurred absent this budget agreement and would have been a 10% across the board spending cut. And it also said there would be no policy riders. We'll see how that works out. Under the budget agreement, now that we have one, the House has to cut $15 billion from its 12 appropriations bills. So that's part of what they're going to be going through in the next couple of weeks. So now that we have a continuing resolution, hopefully, if the Senate takes it up, until November 21, Congress has bought some time to try to pass the Senate bills and conference them with the House. But, you know, things are not always so simple in the Congress, right? So the Senate has begun marking up their bills, but bringing them to the floor has been complicated. It's been complicated by abortion riders. It's been complicated by the deferral of the $3.6 billion from defense funding to fund 11 barrier projects along the southern border. So they're still sorting out how to pass these bills in the Senate. They may actually go to conference with a House-passed bill and a Senate marked-up bill. They've done that before and not have it go through the floor. But some of the less controversial bills, like maybe the energy and water bill, will pass and be conferenced easily. But some bills, like the Homeland Security one in particular, which of course funds the border wall, the southern border, may end up being a year-long continuing resolution. We will, of course, keep you apprised of all developments as they occur moving forward, and we will continue to advocate with you, along with our congressional delegation, on programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program, the Payment in Lieu of Taxes, transportation programs, on all of your priority interests as we move forward in this last part of the process.
So on waters of the U.S., that's also of interest to Leon County, you may know that the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recently announced that the agencies are going to repeal the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule that was enacted under President Obama. With this repeal, because the agencies don't have a replacement rule in place, what that means is all of the states will go back to the pre-2015 rules that they were following. Leon County is not as affected by this because Florida had a stay on the 2015 rule as it was, so you have been operating under the pre-2015 rules right along. However, what is important is what the agencies are offering as a replacement, which is in process now. They've basically carved out 6 categories that they'll say they'll protect, and then they'll exclude everything else. And under the exclusion of everything else includes groundwater, streams that flow when it rains, agricultural ditches, quarries that fill up with water, irrigated areas such as flooded fields for rice or cranberries, and roadside ditches, agricultural ditches, among some other waterways. So there is some controversy. There's several suits that have already been filed. People are concerned about this would allow project development near or on streams or wetlands that would obviously implicate the health of those waters. The other issue is even protecting small waters impacts the quality of water in watersheds for downstream animals and humans. So that will be a process, and there'll be comments on that, and we'll make sure you get that so you can comment as well. But Vicki, you want to talk a little about infrastructure?
I'll kick off the infrastructure, and Sarah will bring up the last part of it, which is, you know, there was a brief moment there of hope when we thought that potentially the President and Congress could come together on a large infrastructure package, but that hasn't happened. It may be revived, who knows, but, you know, we don't think it probably will be. But that was pretty much the House working with the President, and the Senate has been just trundling along, looking towards a regular old-fashioned surface transportation reauthorization. So in the Surface Transportation Act expires a year from now at the end of September next year. And on July 30th, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee marked up the highway portion of a surface transportation bill. In the House, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee has both transit and highways, but in the Senate, the Environment and Public Works Committee has highways, the Banking Committee has transit, the Commerce Committee has rail, and then, of course, in both chambers, the tax rating committees have the revenue implications. So the Environment and Public Works Committee marked up a highway bill. It's a 5-year, $287 billion federal aid highway program, which is a 27% increase over current funding. And it continues highway formula programs, but also includes some new funding for programs focused on bridge projects, climate, and resiliency. And I'll just very quickly go through some of these new programs. This is a very bipartisan bill. There's a bridge investment program, which would be a competitive program to replace, rehab, and preserve bridges. It would be $6.5 billion over 5 years. There's a congestion relief program with discretionary grant money to advance innovative, integrated, multimodal solutions to congestion. That's $40 million a year. A safety incentive program, $500 million annually. It's a formula program that will go out to the MPOs, to the metropolitan planning organizations, for safety improvement projects. There's a carbon reduction incentive program, $600 million annually to reduce transportation carbon emissions. There's something called the PROTECT program. It's $786 million in formula funding, and then an additional $200 million in discretionary competitive money to state and locals for resiliency projects. And then there's a disaster mobilization, which I think might be of interest to all of you, a disaster relief mobilization pilot program for locals to develop disaster preparedness and response plans. It also streamlines environmental programs and other federal permitting processes for infrastructure projects. Finally, the bill repeals the $7.5 billion rescission that's in the current surface transportation program, the FAST Act, that was put in when they were drafting that up so that 3 years before that act expired, which would be July of next year, they would rescind the $7.5 billion, and they did that as a gimmick to make the bill cost less. But it is a problem for particularly state DOTs in looking forward to lose that funding, which may well happen. They tried to put that fix, that repeal, in the continuing resolution, but they couldn't get it in. It is in the Senate version of this highway bill, but who knows when that's going to be passed. So, as we move forward into next year, the other components of the bill will be put together, the transit, the rail. I guess the big question is, how do we pay for it? It's always the big question. And will Congress want to take up a gas tax hike right before the election? And will they want to move to a vehicle miles traveled or some other form of revenue collection to pay for our road infrastructure? So we will, of course, continue to advance your priorities and work with you on this legislation as it gets drafted.
And the House is actually working on a similar bill, not in the highway perspective. So it deals with clean energy and brownfields and healthcare infrastructure, as well as drinking water and broadband infrastructure. But Andy informs me that we'll have to cut it here, and I can, answer any questions if people have.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, just in the interest of time, I know that we do need to wrap up, but of course, you heard a very thorough update from both our state and federal teams as well. Patton Boggs does prepare a summer update memo, which is included as an attachment to your agenda item as well. Happy to answer any additional questions, and if there's any additional information that we can get you beyond the meeting, of course, we're happy to do it. Just moving forward, again, Commissioners, just a few key dates. Jeff mentioned earlier, early legislative session this year from January through March. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I've got a couple of commissioners, but in the interest of time, I'm going to let them go ahead real quickly, Andy, and then we'll move forward with a motion. So Commissioner Dozier and then Commissioner Minor. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, Andy, Nikki, County Administrator, has there been much work in the past before I joined on choice neighborhood grants? Sarah and Vicki and I were talking about this yesterday.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, this Choice Neighborhoods was a priority that the board adopted as part of last year's legislative priorities, and since that time, we've been moving forward. We've met with the city, the housing authority, all of our affordable housing partners to figure out how to best position ourselves for a competitive grant application, and this is a grant program that is extremely competitive nationwide. Also, while we were in Washington for the NACO conference earlier this year, we met with HUD again to figure out kind of what their priorities are in funding grant proposals for this. So, yeah, we're absolutely on top of it, Commissioner.
That's great. When Vicki and Sarah and I were talking about it, it's highly competitive, but it has a cap of $35 million. And as Commissioner Maddox was talking about regarding the state policy, affordable housing is a higher priority for us. If there was a way we could position ourselves to be competitive for that grant, we could do wonders. So,
sir.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dozier, and then we'll entertain a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both very much. There's always so much to get through in a short amount of time, so I'm glad we did have our individual meetings as well. So we talked about this yesterday during our one-on-one meeting, but all of this work that's happening on the infrastructure bill, water, brownfields, others, this is good work that may carry over into 2021, but likely it's not going to get a whole lot of movement next year given the election and everything like that.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So it's still, the updates are good and kind of planning for the future is fantastic. Amtrak, Nikki, you mentioned this a couple times, but how is this adding Florida to the Southern Rail Committee Coalition, whatever that might have been? Is this a request that needs to be made on the federal side? Is this a request to the governor's office? It seems like Florida should be part of that coalition, and we do have a new operator for our rail line through North Florida. So which direction do we go on that?
That's correct, Commissioner. I think it needs to be expressed as a formal priority of the state. So the state legislature would need to take action to formally join the Southern Rail Commission. Of course, they need to work with the governor's office and FDOT, and we have actually had some discussions with FDOT to talk about the potential for ultimately restoration of the passenger rail. Frankly, I haven't heard a ton of enthusiastic support out of that, but we'll continue to work on that. But it would come from the state side to
and that is part of our legislative priorities on this in the section on the Amtrak. I was reading both sections, so just wanted to double check. So,
and we've met with Transportation for America and other partners who are working on this when Andy's been in D.C. So we've been sort of staying in touch with everybody as we move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Vicki.
No.
Moving quickly, all of us are. I would, and I'll make a motion in a second, Mr. Chair, so we can keep moving this on. The MPO funding, the transportation funding, anything about that, we'll be looking forward in your reports, and I really appreciate that. So bringing this in for a close, I believe the motions, Mr. Chair, are staff recommendations, options 1, 2, and 3. Option 1 probably captures our state priorities that we've already passed a motion, but I'll make a motion for options 1, 2, and 3.
Motion's been made, seconded by Commissioner.
I'm sorry. I was about to say with one addition, if you want to hold your seconds. If we can lend our support to any bills that Congressman Dunn introduced some ideas in the last few days, I believe, about disaster supplemental funding and how quickly that might be approved after storms. We waited for 8 months for Hurricane Michael. Any other appropriation requests or bills that may help support Hurricane Michael affected counties or help improve disaster supplemental funding in the future, I would like to add that to our priorities with information coming back from staff.
Do you agree with that, Mary? Commissioner Lindley, for your second.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. That is the motion. Industrial hemp, I did not mention it the entire time. It was incredible, and Jeff's proud of me for not mentioning this the entire time, and Taylor.
That's what time is it?
But industrial hemp is a huge issue on the federal and state side. Would love to see that reflected in the reports going forward as well. Thank you.
Okay, amended motion has been made and seconded by Commissioner Lindley. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed by the same sign. Motion passes. I want to thank you all for coming out today and working us right up until the finish line. We will get a motion to adjourn, and we'll re-adjourn for our regularly scheduled meeting at 3. Moved and seconded.